Those of us who are citizens of liberal democratic regimes don't refer to those who govern us as our rulers, now do we? It's our boast, rather, that we rule ourselves. And there's truth in this boast, inasmuch as we really do participate in choosing those who do rule us. So we prefer to speak of our rulers not as rulers, but as servants, public servants, or at least as people being in public service. You don't find a politician, even a governor or even a president, introducing himself to you at the rope line as he shakes your hand as your ruler. He talks about the privilege of being a public servant, being in public service, and so forth. Now, of course, these so-called servants are nothing remotely like the servants in Downton Abbey, are they? The extraordinary prestige and usually the trappings attaching to public office in just about all times and in just about all places would by themselves be sufficient to distinguish, say, the governor of California or the president of the United States from Carson the butler. But that prestige that our politicians enjoy, or public officials enjoy, signals an underlying fact that discomfits our democratic and egalitarian sensibilities, namely, the fact that even in liberal democracies such as ours, high public officials really are rulers. They make rules. They enforce those rules. And they resolve disputes about the meaning and applicability of the rules. To a very large extent, what they say goes, whether we like it or not, at least until the next election. Now, of course, our rulers rule not by dint of sheer political power, the way the mafia might do in a territory over which it happens to have gained control, but rather our rulers rule lawfully. Constitutional rules specify public offices and settle procedures for filling the offices. Whether the Constitution exists, as it does here in the United States, in the form of a specific document, such as the Constitution of the United States or the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts or Virginia, or in some other form as an unwritten constitution, as in the Constitution of the United Kingdom or the Constitution of New Zealand. However it exists, in whatever form, it constitutes the set of rules governing the rulers, rules that both empower office holders to make and execute decisions of various sorts and places limitations on their power. It establishes the scope of the official's authority to rule. So though our rulers are indeed rulers, they are not absolute rulers. They rule subject to constitutional norms, constitutional constraints. Constitutional rules set the scope and thus the limits of their jurisdiction and authority. They are rulers who are subject to rules, rules they do not themselves, at least exclusively by themselves, make, and cannot easily or purely on their own initiative revise and repeal them, although we all know there are some issues about that today. Some of those issues have to do with exercises of executive power by the government currently, by the federal government currently, by President Obama. Our leaders or rulers rule, that is, in limited ways and ordinarily for limited terms, which may or may not be indefinitely renewable at the pleasure of the voters. They rule by virtue of democratic processes by which they came to hold the office. They can be removed or significantly disempowered at the next election if the people are not happy with them. Still, having said all that about the limits of their authority, their power, their jurisdiction, still, they rule. They are rulers. There's no point in pretending otherwise. Now, my point is not to hoot at the idea of government and those holding governmental offices and controlling the levers of governmental powers as servants. This is not a debunking exercise that I'm interested in doing tonight. On the contrary, I want in the end to defend the idea that rulers can be servants, and indeed that they should be servants. That's not a foolish or naive notion. I want to establish, however, that if these people we call public servants are indeed servants, They are servants in a special sense, a sense that is compatible with them at the same time being rulers. They are people who serve us precisely by ruling. That's the service they give us. They serve us well by ruling well, by establishing sound and just rules, by enforcing them fairly, even-handedly, by interpreting them authentically, applying them correctly. If they rule badly, by failing in any of those respects, then they serve us poorly. Indeed, they disserve us. Now, there are, of course, lots of ways that rulers can disserve those whom they have a moral obligation to serve by ruling well. Most obviously, there is incompetence. Then, of course, there is corruption. And at the extreme, there is tyranny. Even a democratic or republican order can degenerate into tyranny. So what does it mean for the ruler truly to be a servant? What does it mean for someone holding political office and exercising public power to rule well? Well, it means, at the most abstract and general level, making and executing decisions that really are for the sake of the common good, the public good, not the good of this party or that party. This, by party I don't mean political party, I mean this individual or group or association or organization, this union, this corporation, not ruling in private interests, favoring some over others, but truly ruling for the public interest. Such decisions will necessarily be compatible with the requirements of justice, and at the same time, those decisions will embody justice. If we understand the concept of the common good properly, and I'll say a word about that in just a moment, then we will see that no decision that violates a requirement of justice is truly for the common good. And no decision that genuinely upholds and serves the common good will fail to advance the cause of justice. It's also important to note that decisions can fail to serve the common good and can indeed damage the common good, even when they are not unjust. Even honorably motivated and well-intentioned people, including rulers, can make decisions that harm the common good because they are inexpedient or imprudent or unwise. Holders of public office, like anyone else, can make poor, even disastrous decisions, even when acting on the purest and best motives. Poor decisions by well-intentioned public officials can trigger or prolong a Great Depression. Just made the wrong call, with the result being massive human suffering. Not out of bad will, partisanship, corruption, favoring this union, that corporation. No, a well-intentioned ruler seeking to serve the common good can make a bad call, triggering or prolonging a depression. A ruler can lead a nation into an unnecessary and even disastrous war. Or a ruler, despite best of intentions, can prevent a nation from going to war to protect its people and their vital interests when it should have done. There's no reason to think that Neville Chamberlain, who sought to appease Hitler, was a well-intentioned bad guy. He certainly wasn't a Nazi sympathizer. After the horrible carnage, the unbelievable suffering of the First World War, which our ancestors here in America knew a little about, but nothing like the suffering of the British people. You can see why Chamberlain wanted to do everything he could do to avoid another one. And so he tried this policy of appeasement. He hoped it would work. And he gave Hitler this, and he gave Hitler that, and he gave Hitler the other thing, and finally drew the line at Poland. We now look back and we think of Neville Chamberlain as the bad guy, the appeaser, the guy who unwittingly advanced Hitler's cause. But it was unwitting. He was well-intentioned. But even well-intentioned rulers can make bad mistakes, leading us into a war we shouldn't be in, or perhaps preventing us from defending ourselves or other people, innocent people, when we should have. Poor decisions can undermine or weaken the marriage culture, and with it family life and everything in a society that depends on the health and vibrancy of the institution of marriage. It's worth adding here that reasonable people of goodwill can and obviously do disagree about what the common good requires and forbids, and what is, in truth, just and unjust. Obviously, we have no consensus in this society about many, many important issues pertaining to justice and the common good. Honorable people exercising public power can commit injustices, even grave injustices, while seeking in good faith to do justice and believing in good faith that they are doing it. So just as not all violations of the common good are injustices, not all injustices are the result of malice or ill will or like vices. Still, all injustices, even if committed by public officials who are sincerely trying to do the right thing, harm the common good. For justice itself is a common good. It's a good of the whole community, not of some private part of it. And justice is a central aspect of the common good of the political community. It's to the benefit of each and every citizen to live in a just social order. And it's a harm to that order. Any harm to that order is therefore a loss for everyone, and not merely for the immediate and obvious victims of the particular injustice. Indeed, it's a loss even for the ostensible beneficiaries of injustices, and indeed even for the perpetrators of injustices, though naturally true evildoers don't see it that way. Corruption of character narrows their vision of the good, blinding them to the profound respects in which wrongdoing harms what is in truth their interest in living in a just society, as well as everyone else's. There's not a soul in this room, there's not a soul in this university or county or state or country or world who doesn't share in the benefit of a just social order. It's for the good of all. It's an aspect of our individual good to live in a justly ordered community. Now, the common good requires that there be rulers. That's the sense in which rulers really do serve us, at least when they rule well. We need that service. We need to be ruled. Not just because we're bad and we'll do bad things unless we have somebody cracking the whip. But we need to be ruled. We need rules that are made by rulers to coordinate our behavior, coordinate our activity for the sake of common ends that benefit us all. Now, to grasp this is to begin to see the sense in which good rulers really are truly servants. Members of societies face a range, sometimes a vast range, of challenges and opportunities, requiring both means to ends and persons to persons coordination, including, in the case of complex societies like ours, coordination problems presented by the large number and complexity of other coordination problems. We need to organize things to make things happen that will benefit us all, or to protect us. Since such problems cannot, as a practical matter, be addressed and resolved by unanimity, as they might be able to do in some small and insular community, authority, therefore political authority, is required. I'll give you an easy example of this, just a simple example. We'll lay aside complexities just so you see what I'm talking about. We all have a common interest in public health and public safety, right? We're all members of the public. We want safe conditions. Now, in a society in which there are automobiles, and where automobiles are widely owned and used, you can have a lot of really big problems with health and safety and efficiency and economy unless you have a scheme of traffic regulation, deciding whether there should be stop signs here and here, or here and here, whether there should be a stoplight or not a stoplight, whether 2nd Avenue should be one-way south and 3rd Avenue one-way north, a whole range of coordination issues. Unless somebody, some authority, coordinates a plan, we're going to run into two big problems, even if everybody is well-intentioned and respectful of each other and the common good. Even in a society of saints, you'd have people crashing into each other, trying to get through the intersection, people of goodwill, trying their best, and you would have unbelievable traffic jams, impeding the transportation of goods and persons. So you'd have economic problems as a result of that, You'd have lots of problems. So public health and public safety as public goods require that there be a scheme of traffic coordination. But one doesn't just happen. It's not something that emerges by tradition. It's not something that we can agree on by unanimity. You need to have rules, and you need rulers to make the rules. It's a simple case. There are many, many more complex cases. So we shouldn't think of law simply as concerned with punishing wrongdoing, murder, rape, and theft, and so forth. Law does that. But perhaps even more importantly, in a complex society like ours, or more fundamentally, law coordinates behavior for the sake of the common good. So institutions will have to be created and maintained, and persons will need to be installed in the offices of these institutions to make the choices that must be made, the decisions that must be made, and to do the things that need to be done for the sake of protecting public health, safety, and morals, and upholding the rights and dignity of individuals, families, non-governmental entities of various descriptions, and just overall advancing the common good. That's what authority does. That's the justification and point of authority. That's why it's necessary. That's why we have rules, why we have rulers to make the rules, and why those rulers really do, when they rule well, honestly, fairly, competently, function as servants. They serve us by ruling well. As I say, this would be true even in a society of perfect saints, where no one ever sought more than his fair share from the common stock, or violated the rights of others, or deliberately acted in any manner that was contrary to the common good. Even in such a society, effective coordination for the sake of the common good, and thus for the good of all, would be required. And seeking unanimity, assuming a large and fairly complex society like ours, would not be a practical option. So authority is required, and that means persons exercising authority, rulers ruling. But the moral justification for the ruler's ruling is service to all, to the common good. And the common good is not an abstraction or a platonic form hovering somewhere beyond the concrete well-being, the flourishing of flesh and blood persons constituting the community. No, it just is the well-being of those persons and of the families and other associations of persons, Burke's little platoons of civil society, of which they are members. The right of legitimate rulers to rule is rooted in the duty of rulers to rule in the interest of all. Like other rights, if you look behind the right, you'll find a duty. And behind the duty, you'll find a set of values that need to be preserved, protected, advanced, that are protected by the duty. The right of legitimate rulers to rule is rooted in the duty of rulers to rule in the interest of all. In other words, the basis of the right to rule is in the duty to serve. And the realities that constitute the content of service are the various elements of the common good. By doing what is for the common good and by avoiding doing anything that harms the common good, rulers fulfill their obligations to the people over whom they exercise authority, thus serving their interests, their welfare, their flourishing, in a word, serving them. I don't know how to improve on the definition of the common good proposed by my teacher at Oxford, John Finnis, in his magisterial book, Natural Law and Natural Rights, which has now been printed in a second edition by Oxford University Press alongside 5 volumes of his collected essays. The common good, Professor Finnis says, is to be understood as a set of conditions which enables the members of a community to attain for themselves reasonable objections or to realize reasonably for themselves the values for the sake of which they have reason to collaborate with each other in a community, unquote. Now, every community, from the basic community of the family to the community of a church or other community of religious faith, to a mutual aid society or other civic association, to a business firm, any community will have a common good. The common good is constituted by the reasons, the values, for the sake of which they have reason to collaborate, to join together, to coordinate their behavior. The common good of some communities is fundamentally an intrinsic good, rather than a merely instrumental good. That is, the thing is desired for its own sake, and not for the sake of something else to which it is an effective instrument, a tool. Although families serve many valuable and some indispensable instrumental purposes, the point of the family as an institution is not exhausted by these purposes, nor do they define what the family is. The most fundamental point of being a member of the family is simply being a member of the family, enjoying the intrinsic benefit, the intrinsic enrichment of being part of that distinctive network of mutual obligation, care, love, and support. And you don't have to romanticize families, which have their flaws. There's that famous line about, friends are God's compensation for giving us families. You don't have to romanticize the family to understand that the point of the family is not merely the instrumental goods that the family serves. It's being a member of that distinctive community of care, mutual obligation, love, and support. The same is true, in my opinion, and in not only my opinion, but in Christian and Jewish thought, of the common good of the community of faith. Though communities of faith characteristically serve many valuable instrumental purposes, soup kitchens, educational institutions, hospitals, giving us some place to go on Sunday morning for a little entertainment, the most fundamental purpose of Israel or the church is to be the people of God. That's it. It's not something to which being the people of God is a means. It's the being the people. There's lots of instrumental benefits to it. The church is doing its job. It's doing all kinds of jobs. But most fundamentally, we are the church when we are the church. It's the intrinsic benefit of that distinctive community. It's koinonia. That is the point, the justifying point of the reality of the church. Things are obviously different, though, when it comes to, say, business firms. And this is not to denigrate business. But notice the difference. Although there are ordinarily many opportunities for principals and employees of companies to realize intrinsic or basic human goods, including the goods that are fundamentally social, such as the good of friendship, in their collaborations in pursuit of the firm's objectives, you can have all sorts of wonderful opportunities to have really enriching friendships working together in a business. Still, those objectives themselves are the ends to which the firm and the cooperation of those working in it and for it are means. We don't establish a business firm to be a business firm. The point of the church is to be the people of God, and the point of the family is to be the family. No, business firms are created to provide goods and services, to make a profit for the owners or shareholders. Then there are lots of intrinsic benefits and other things. In the meantime, you're providing good employment for people. There are lots of side benefits. But there are the instrumental goals that give the point. There are certain instrumental goals that are the point of the collaboration. So then, of course, the obvious question has probably occurred to you. If the good of the family and the church is fundamentally an intrinsic good, if that's the common good of those institutions, communities, and the common good of business firms at the other extreme is fundamentally an instrumental good, even if there are many opportunities for intrinsically fulfilling things in the course of running the business, what about the good of the political community? Where does it fit? Is it like a business firm? Is it like the family? And of course, we're especially concerned about understanding the common good of the political community because that's the common good that rulers are supposed to serve. They're good servants precisely to the extent that they rule in the interest for the common good of the political community. So is that common good an intrinsic or an instrumental good? Well, there is in what the late Sir Isaiah Berlin referred to as the central tradition of Western thought about morality, including political morality, that tradition from Plato and Aristotle all the way up to the Enlightenment. There is a powerful current of belief that the common good of the political society is an intrinsic good. This, for example, seems to be the position of Aristotle, and many self-identified Thomists are firmly convinced that it was the view of Aristotle's greatest interpreter and expositor, St. Thomas Aquinas. Professor Finnis, however, argues that the common good of political society, though, to quote Aristotle, is great and godlike, unquote, in its range and importance, is nevertheless fundamentally an instrumental and not an intrinsic good. And he further argues that the instrumental nature of the common good of political society entails limitations on the legitimate scope of governmental authority, limitations that, though not in every case easily articulable in the language of rights, are requirements of justice. Now, although I have a difference at the margins with Professor Finnis, who, along with Professor Joseph Raz, was my graduate supervisor in Oxford, as I said, on the question of just what the limits are of the scope of political authority, and in particular whether they exclude in principle moral paternalism. I agree that the common good of political society is fundamentally an instrumental good, and that this entails moral limits on justified governmental power. So I agree with that. The way we have come to think of these limits is in terms of what's usually called the doctrine of subsidiarity. Is that term used in this context of political authority and the role of government in relation to institutions of civil society familiar to people? How many people have heard of the doctrine of subsidiarity? I see a few hands up, so please correct me if I explain it incorrectly. But my understanding is this. Well, let me state its canonical presentation, which came in the form of a papal encyclical in 1931. The doctrine was actually developed in the 19th century by theologians, adopted by philosophers as well, but it's been a central part of the teaching of the Catholic popes going all the way back to Leo XIII at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. But there's a great statement of it in a 1931 encyclical of Pope Pius XI called Quadragesimo Anno. And here's what he says. Just as it's wrong to withdraw from the individual and commit to a group what private initiative and effort can accomplish, so too it is wrong for a larger and higher association to arrogate to itself functions which can be performed efficiently by smaller and lower associations. This is a fixed, unchanged, and most weighty principle of moral philosophy. Of its very nature, the true aim of all social activity should be to help members of a social body and never to absorb or destroy them, unquote. So that's a pretty good, indeed canonical statement of what the doctrine of subsidiarity is. If something can be done by a lower, smaller unit, let it be done there for the sake of the benefit of those who are served by it. If it can't be done there, only then do we kick it up to a larger unit. If the family can accomplish it, well, let the family do it. Don't let the larger unit of society come in and displace the family, usurp its authority, take over. But if the family can't do it, well then move it up to the neighborhood, which is sort of the family of families. And if the neighborhood can't do it, move it up to the larger community, maybe a provincial governmental unit, or if something that needs to be done by a centralized power, like military defense, for example, let that be done. Since families obviously can't do that, and even neighborhoods can't do it, and even provinces can't do it, let it be done then by the central authority. Now, this principle of justice and the common good reflects a particular understanding of the nature and content of human flourishing, human well-being. Flourishing consists in doing things, not just in getting things, or having desirable or pleasant experiences, or having things done for you. The whole doctrine of subsidiarity rests on that Aristotelian point, that the good consists in activity. Flourishing consists in doing things. The good, as Aristotle taught, really does consist in the activities in which specific goods are realized. Human goods are realized by acting. One participates in them, thus enriching one's life and even ennobling oneself as one exercises and fulfills one's natural human capacities. For example, one's capacities for friendship, or the acquisition of knowledge, or understanding, or critical aesthetic appreciation, or any of a range of other aspects of human well-being. And so the common good is, as Finnis remarked, best conceived as a set of conditions. If you remember that quote I read from Professor Finnis's book, Natural Law and Natural Rights, he says the common good is a set of conditions, and I think that's exactly the right way to think about it. conditions, not what's realized or achieved by the conditions. When we're talking about the common good of political society, it's establishing conditions. But we must ask, of course, conditions for what? Well, let's recall that definition. Conditions for enabling members of a community to attain, do you remember my putting emphasis on the next two words? For themselves. Reasonable objectives, or to realize reasonably for themselves the values for the sake of which they have reason to collaborate with each other in a community. The common good is, in this sense, facilitative. It facilitates us, as members of the community, whose common good it is, in realizing for ourselves, as individuals, as families, as small civic associations, as neighborhoods, as unions, as groups, realize for ourselves those aspects of our good as individuals which we achieve by activity, by participation. The elements of the common good are what enable people to do things individually and in cooperation with others, the doing of which, to a significant degree, constitutes our all-round or integral flourishing. Under favorable conditions, people can more fully and more successfully carry out reasonable projects, pursue reasonable objectives, and thus participate in values, human goods, including some values that are inherently social, and that they fulfill people in respective capacities for non-instrumental forms of interpersonal communion or relationships, friendships, and so forth, that are indeed constitutive of their well-being and fulfillment. Now notice that the doctrine of subsidiarity is not an individualist doctrine. This doctrine gives no comfort to the philosophy favored by Ayn Rand. It is entirely compatible with, indeed it assumes the validity of, forms of human interpersonal relationship that are understood by those in the relationships as being valuable, not because being in the relationship enables us more efficiently or fully to realize our individual goals, like a business partnership. It realizes that many of our relationships are relationships that are themselves of intrinsic value. We enter into them not because of they enable us to get something else more efficiently or more fully, but what we're after is the enriching quality of the relationship itself, the non-instrumental value of the friendship or other form of association. Properly understood, then, the common good requires, as a matter of justice, limited government. Government that respects the needs and rights of people to pursue objectives and realize goods for themselves. Notice that the Pope was writing in 1931. Remember I said that encyclical was 1931? It's Pius XI, if anybody knows anything about modern church history. Pius XI is the guy who wrote the famous encyclical against the Nazis, Mit Brenneter Sorge. Why would Pope Pius XI be thinking about subsidiarity in 1931? Why would he be thinking about the principles of limited government in 1931? Well, it's obvious, right? The world is facing a choice now between systems in which government is limited and systems which are very attractive to a lot of people in the circumstances of 1931 that do not know limits, that are in that sense totalitarian. It was not a settled issue whether the way to go forward was with regimes of republican government, limited government, or communist or fascist forms of totalitarianism. Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of President Kennedy, in that period was appointed by President Roosevelt, just a few years later, appointed by President Roosevelt ambassador to the court of St. James, ambassador to Britain. He was a very ambitious man, very wealthy man, one of the wealthiest men in the United States, very politically ambitious, wanted to be president of the United States, wanted Roosevelt's job. He destroyed his own prospects, his own political future, by saying something that seems totally crazy today, but which you can understand somebody saying back then, even if you didn't agree with it. And as I say, a lot of people didn't agree with it. It destroyed his political career. He said, looking at what was happening, what was available, what was being accomplished by the totalitarian regimes, the authoritarian regimes, and comparing it to what was happening in Britain and the United States and other democratic regimes. Britain, of course, is not a republic, but a monarchy, technically. Joseph P. Kennedy said, "Democracy is dead in Europe and may soon be dead here too." That's why he didn't become president. He wanted very much for his son to become president. Of course, one of his sons did. His thought at those days was that his older son, who was killed in World War II, would become president. But it wasn't clear. What that little story reminds us is that it wasn't clear whether the future was with democracy or not. That's why the Pope is trying to send a message, a teaching about the need for subsidiarity, limits on the authoritative central state. There were plenty of attractions in communism and fascism, especially in a period of economic collapse, the Great Depression, the aftermath, the horrors of the First World War, anarchy and chaos in many nations, the Weimar regime in Germany descending into it, out of control inflation. So people were wondering, well, maybe democracy just isn't the way to go. Limited government just isn't the way to go. You know, Mussolini can make the trains run on time. And Mussolini was much admired, by the way, prior to the war. In this period, Mussolini, who became the model for Hitler, he precedes Hitler. Mussolini was much admired. People thought, well, gee, you know, he's brought order. We don't have order in our democratic countries. We don't have economic stability. He was able to bring order to Italy. Maybe that's the way to go. So the Pope is pleading with the world for subsidiarity, for limited government. That just didn't come out of nowhere. The Pope didn't wake up one day and say, I got an idea, let's write today an encyclical on subsidiarity. No, it's because there was a real issue there. So the fundamental role of legitimate government, and thus the responsibility of legitimate rulers who serve, is not to be doing things for people that they could do for themselves. That's the Mussolini story. It's rather to be helping to establish and maintain conditions that favor people's doing things for themselves and with and for each other. Governments should do things for people as opposed to letting them do things for themselves, only where individuals and non-governmental institutions of civil society cannot do them or cannot reasonably be expected to do them for themselves, whether that is providing military protection or, in extreme circumstances, a safety net for people who otherwise would starve or live in very abject conditions. But where government needn't step in, the principle is government shouldn't step in. So Finnish uses the word enable. It corresponds to that term I introduced earlier, facilitate, facilitative. And I think it's the right word here. Government's legitimate concern is with the establishment and maintenance of the conditions under which members of the community are enabled to pursue the projects and goals by and through which they participate in the goods constitutive of their flourishing. Now, this facilitative conception of the common good does not require a doctrinaire liberalism. As I say, this gives no aid and comfort to Ayn Rand, either in the domain of political economy or social morality. But it clearly does exclude corporatist and socialist policies that, to recall those words from Pius XI, withdraw from the individual and commit to the group what private individual effort and initiative can accomplish, unquote, or which remove from the family or the religious or civic association and commit to government what can be accomplished by non-governmental collaborative effort. Surely a conception of the common good that is serious about the principle of subsidiarity will respect private property and take care to maintain a reasonably free, although regulated, system of economic exchange, that is to say, a functioning market economy. Social or comprehensive or widespread state ownership of the means of production is plainly incompatible with subsidiarity's concerns and objectives, as is anything resembling a command economy. And this would be true even if the record of socialist states were benign when it comes to respect for civil liberties and political freedom, which on the whole it certainly is not. And it would be true even if, again, contrary to the historical record, private property in the market system were not necessary checks against the excessive concentration and abuse of power in the hands of public officials, which is not to say that you cannot get abuses of power when power is concentrated in private hands, or the hands of private powerful trusts or corporations or interests. But as I've noted, the historical record demonstrates that private property in the market system, while not sufficient guarantees against the concentration and abuse of political power, plutocracy is still possible, are for all intents and purposes necessary as conditions for civil liberty and limited government. And there is a profound lesson in this for those of us who are interested in ensuring that rulers remain servants, ruling in the interests of citizens, and do not reduce citizens to a condition of dependency or servitude. For it's critical to the effective limitation of governmental power that there be substantial non-governmental centers of power in society. Private property in the market economy not only provide the conditions of social mobility, which is important to the common good in any modern dynamic society, but also ensure that there are significant resources and thus opportunities for people in their private associations that are not in the control of the government or the hands of officials or the apparatus of the state. This diffusion of power benefits society as a whole and not merely those who immediately benefit economically from the possession of property or the ability to profit in the market. And I'm not simply here talking about general prosperity, though that's another benefit of private property in the market system, an increased level of prosperity. I'm talking about the benefit to all in terms of liberty, opportunity, and security of the diffusion of power. The more widespread power is, the better for everybody, the safer for everybody. If it gets concentrated too much in any place, whether it's government or corporate, you got a danger to the common good of all. And this goes well beyond economics. If we understand the common good, if we have a grasp of what constitutes or is conducive to the flourishing of human beings and what is not, we'll recognize that limited government is also important because it permits the functioning and flourishing of non-governmental institutions of civil society, those little platoons again, as Burke called them, families, churches, civic associations, Boy Scouts, campfire girls, fire halls, rod and gun clubs, trades unions, ethnic self-help societies, you name it, that perform better than government could ever conceivably do the most essential health, education, and welfare functions to which which play the primary role in transmitting to each new generation the virtues without which free societies cannot survive: basic honesty, integrity, self-restraint, concern for others, respect for their dignity and rights, civic-mindedness, and the like. Those virtues, if they get imparted not because of governmental mandates, but because of the functioning of families assisted by churches, Boy Scouts, campfire girls, civic associations, and so forth. It's the only way they happen. Now, these non-governmental authority structures represent another crucial way in which power is properly diffused and not concentrated in any single set of hands, whether it's the state and its officials or whether it's the kind of crony capitalist system in which government and large corporate interests feather each other's beds. They can play their role only when government is limited, for unlimited government always usurps the authority of the institutions of civil society, including the authority of the family and the state, and destroys their autonomy, usually recruiting or commandeering them into being state functionary organs. And where they are playing their proper role, these institutions help to create the conditions in which the ideal of limited government is much more likely to be realized and preserved, and its benefits enjoyed by the people. If those institutions are flourishing, the government doesn't have to step in so much. Where those institutions break down, think of inner city Detroit, think of my native Appalachia, where so much of civil society now has been lost, government has no choice but to step in. Even people who want to have limited government realize somebody's got to go in to preserve order, to provide basic social services, meet people's basic needs. If you want limited government, you should, you need to worry about the health of the institutions of civil society, without which there simply can be no limited government. Now, I'll return to these institutions of civil society toward the end of my remarks, but now let me shift the discussion to the question of constitutional structural constraints on the power of government. Historically, political theorists have focused on the need for such constraints as the most obvious and important way to ensure that governmental power remains limited and that rulers serve the people and do not become tyrants. And I myself think that constraints of this nature are important to the cause, though I'll eventually get round to saying that they're likely to be effective only when they are part of a larger picture in which they are supported by and in turn support other features of social life that help keep government within its proper limited bounds for the sake of the common good. So as important as they are, would warn against placing too great an emphasis on constitutional structures and constraints. The danger there is ignoring the other essential features. And I say that as somebody who's a real partisan of the Madisonian system, as a constitutional law teacher and someone who really believes that constitutional constraints are critically important. But here my warning is, don't focus on them so much that you think they can do the job all by themselves. They can't. I'll say more in a moment about that. Now, our constitutional system here in the United States is famous for its Madisonian structure, the system of structural constraints on the power of the central government. Now, more than 200 years of experience with the Madisonian system gives us a pretty good perspective on both its strengths and its limitations. The major structural constraints that I'm interested in tonight are these. Number one, the doctrine of the general government is a government of delegated and enumerated and therefore limited powers. An essential part, maybe even you would say the keystone, of the Madisonian constitutional system that is our legacy. Number two, the dual sovereignty of the general government and the states, with the states functioning as governments of general jurisdiction, exercising generalized police powers, kind of plenary authority, limited under the national constitution only by specific prohibitions or by grants of power to the general government in a federal union. So you see that in our country we've got a dual system of sovereignty. Unlike Britain, let's say, or France, where the power of regional or local governments is purely derivative of the central power, the government of Yorkshire is purely derivative in its powers of Westminster. Here, the power of California is a constitutionally distinct sovereign authority. Within its scope, within its sphere, California has plenary authority. It's a government of general jurisdiction. It's only where authority has been delegated by the people of the United States through the Constitution to the national government that the national government has powers that trump the powers of the government of California. This is the idea of the Madisonian system. Three, structural constraints. The third structural constraint. The separation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers within the national government, creating the famous system of checks and balances that you learned about in civics in high school, that limit the power of any one branch, and it's hoped, improves the quality of government by making the legislative and policy-making processes more challenging, slower, and more deliberative. Now, there are lots of people who have a problem with that today. They would prefer a parliamentary system where things can be made to happen quickly. And presidents in particular get frustrated with the slow workings of the Madisonian system by making things slow and challenging and more deliberative, and occasionally a president will say, I've got a pen and a phone, and I can move more quickly than that. But all presidents get frustrated like that. The system is designed to make change, make legislation a deliberative, slow process. And if you want to know why, read Federalist 10. Madison lays it all out there. Number four, the practice, nowhere, by the way, expressly authorized in the Constitution, lay that aside for the moment. The practice of constitutional judicial review by the federal courts. That is, the power that the courts have claimed for themselves with no express grant in the Constitution to invalidate federal or state laws or executive actions on the grounds that they are contrary to the Constitution. Now, I often ask my students at the beginning of my undergraduate course on civil liberties, it's a course I'm teaching now at Princeton, how the framers of the Constitution of the United States sought to preserve liberty and prevent tyranny. It seems to me this is the basic question of American civil liberties. How's the Constitution supposed to protect liberty and prevent tyranny? That's it. Now, it is, alas, a testament to the poor quality of civic education in the United States that almost none of the students can answer the question correctly. And it's not just Princeton students. I taught last year at Harvard, and I asked the same question, and I got the same incorrect answer. Nor, I suspect, Could the editors of the New York Times or other opinion-shaping elites answer the question correctly? The typical answer goes this way. Well, Professor, I can tell you how the framers of the Constitution sought to protect liberty and prevent tyranny. They attached to the Constitution a Bill of Rights to protect the individual and minorities against the tyranny of the majority. And they vested the power to enforce those rights in the hands of judges who serve for life and are not subject to recall or election, and who cannot be removed from office except on impeachment for serious misconduct, and whose compensation cannot be reduced by way of political retaliation, and they are therefore in a position to protect people's rights without fear of political reprisal. And then the student smiles at what a great answer that was. Now, this is about as wrong as you can get it. But it's widely believed, and as I say, not just by university students. None of the American founders, even among those who favored judicial review, such as Hamilton, and regarded it as implicit in the Constitution, which not all did, believed that it was the central or even a significant constraint on the power of the national government. They thought it was a backup, something that might be able to help a bit, but not the core constraining, protecting, tyranny-preventing, liberty-protecting principle. Nor did they believe that the enforcement of Bill of Rights guarantees by courts would be a central way of protecting liberty. The Federalists, in the original sense of those who supported the proposed Constitution, the term would take on a different meaning shortly thereafter, as those of you who've done American history know. The Federalists, in that first sense, old-fashioned sense, generally opposed the addition of a Bill of Rights. Can you believe that? The great heroes, Hamilton, Madison himself, although he later, as a matter of political expediency, did shift over, opposed the Bill of Rights. Are you shocked? Are you scandalized? The Bill of Rights, they opposed the bill. We venerate the Bill of Rights, right? It's our great bulwark against tyranny, the charter of our liberties. And Madison wasn't for it. And Hamilton actively wrote against it in the Federalist Papers. You can read it there. The great documents that explain the meaning of the Constitution. Why did they oppose it? Because they feared that it would actually undermine what they regarded as the main structural constraints protecting freedom and preventing tyranny. Namely, one, the conception and public understanding of the general government not as a government of general jurisdiction exercising plenary powers, but rather as a government of delegated and enumerated and therefore limited powers. And two, the division of powers between the national governments and the states in a system of dual sovereignty. When political necessity forced the Federalists, like Madison, to yield to demands for a Bill of Rights in the form of the first 8 amendments to the Constitution, they took care to add 2 more amendments, the 9th and 10th, designed to reinforce the delegated powers doctrine and the federalism principles that they feared would be obscured or weakened by the inclusion of a Bill of Rights, you see. As for the way judicial review functioned as a structural constraint in American history, suffice it to say that the practice has given the eminent Oxford legal and political philosopher Jeremy Waldron, who's a fierce critic of judicial review, plenty of ammunition in making his case around the world against permitting judges to invalidate legislation on constitutional grounds. The federal courts, and the Supreme Court in particular, have had their glory moments, to be sure, such as the racial desegregation case of Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. But they have also handed down decision after decision, from Dred Scott against Sanford in the 1850s, which facilitated the expansion of slavery, to Roe versus Wade in the 1970s, which legalized abortion through the United States, in which they have plainly overstepped the bounds of their own authority, and without any warrant in the text or logic or structure or original understanding of the Constitution, imposed their own personal, moral, or political opinions on the entire nation under the pretext of enforcing constitutional guarantees. These usurpations are, quite apart from whatever one's views happen to be on slavery and abortion, a stain on the court and a disgrace to the constitutional system, bringing it into disrepute and undermining its basic democratic principles, and giving strong critics of judicial review, like Professor Waldron, plenty of ammo. Moreover, since the 1930s, the courts have done very little indeed by way of exercising the power of judicial review to support the other constitutional structural constraints on the exercise of central governmental power. A very small number of isolated decisions have struck down this or that specific piece of federal legislation as exceeding the delegated powers of the national government or trenching upon the reserved powers of the states, but that's about it. Most recently and spectacularly, the Supreme Court found a way by a bare majority to uphold what seemed to many to be a rather obvious case of constitutional overreaching by the national government, the imposition of an individual mandate requiring citizens to purchase health insurance coverage as part of President Obama's signature Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. The government defended the mandate as a legitimate exercise of the expressly delegated power to regulate commerce among the several states. To have valid federal legislation, there's got to be a constitutional delegation of the power. The administration said, well, in this case, the power that we're exercising that was delegated to us by the Constitution is the power of the national government to regulate commerce among the states. The trouble, of course, with that argument is that on its face, the mandate does not appear to regulate commerce at all. It seems rather to force people into commerce, a particular kind of commerce, on pain of a financial penalty. Now, the court's four liberal justices, including my friend Justice Kagan, were willing to stick to what has become longstanding tradition for those in their ideological camp, namely counting virtually anything the national government proposes to do as a legitimate exercise of the power to regulate interstate commerce, if that's what the government says it is. The five more conservative justices were willing to say that whatever is going on with the imposition of a mandate to purchase health insurance, it is not regulating interstate commerce. So a majority could not be gotten together for the idea that this actually was a legitimate exercise of the commerce power. One of the five, however, Chief Justice Roberts, decided to reinterpret the penalty as something that the administration and its supporters in Congress had repeatedly and vociferously denied it was during the debate leading up to the passage of the act, namely a tax. He then joined the four liberals on the court to uphold the mandate and legislation as a whole as constitutionally permissible as a tax. His four fellow members of the majority didn't agree that it was a tax. They were upholding it on Commerce Clause grounds, but his fifth vote to uphold nevertheless resulted in a victory for their side. Now, in my view, it is not a decision that should have come to the courts at all. Congress itself and the President should have recognized and honored the fact that the Constitution does not empower the national government to impose a mandate on people to purchase products, including health care coverage. One of the problems with judicial review in general is that its practice tends to encourage the belief among legislators, and worse still among citizens more broadly, that the constitutionality of proposed legislation is not the concern of the people's elected representatives. If a proposed piece of legislation is unconstitutional, they say, then it's up to the courts to strike it down. But this is a travesty. Do you guys ever throw things at your television set? Anybody watch C-SPAN? Do you ever watch C-SPAN? So we have no real political junkies. So this thing called C-SPAN. And one of the things C-SPAN features is hours and hours of congressmen in empty chambers talking to somebody that we don't see, usually with a chart. He's got a chart behind him. Well, every now and then, that somebody will have, that congressman will have a second congressman there on the other side, and they'll be actually having a debate. And then it gets kind of interesting. And sometimes when they're having a debate, one honorable gentleman will say to the other honorable gentleman or gentlelady, this piece of legislation is absolutely essential to the welfare of American people, good American people, especially good American people in the state of Texas, and especially in the 5th Congressional District of the state of Texas, where I happen to have the honor of representing them. And the other honorable gentleman will say, well, that may or may not be, as the honorable gentleman from Texas says, but We have no constitutional authority to do this. That act is unconstitutional, to which the honorable gentleman from Texas replies, that's not up to us. The courts will tell us whether it's constitutional. We should enact it, and the courts will tell us whether it's unconstitutional. This is where I throw things at the TV. Who came up with that idea? It's up to every member of every ruler, every federal official, at least at the head of a department, congressman, the president, and Supreme Court justices, to interpret the Constitution concerning the scope of their own authority. We shouldn't reserve constitutional debate to the courts, and it shouldn't be shifted by the legislature to the courts. Those congressmen had an obligation to debate the constitutionality of the legislation and to defeat the legislation, even if it was a good idea, if their best judgment was that the legislation was unconstitutional. So for structural constraints to accomplish what they're meant to accomplish, for them to constrain the power of the government as they're meant to do, the question of the constitutionality of legislation in light of those constraints is everybody's business. Judges exercising judicial review, yes, to be sure, but also legislators, executives, and the people themselves, we the people. We should be actively debating and letting our opinions be known to our representatives and our courts about our view of the constitutionality of legislation. I mean, at the end of the day, as our founders themselves perfectly well understood, we are the guardians of our constitutional liberties. We are the guardians of the meaning of our Constitution. It's not up to them. They've got a job to do. They've got to interpret the Constitution. And Lincoln was right in his first inaugural address when he says presidents as well as courts have an obligation to interpret the Constitution and to live in accordance with their best judgments of the constitutional scope of their own authorities, but it's up to us as citizens as well. And that brings me to the critical yet oddly neglected subject of political culture and civic virtue. Now, I mentioned my friend Professor Waldron earlier. A few years ago, he visited his native New Zealand to read his countrymen the Riot Act about what he condemned as the abysmal quality of that nation's parliamentary debates. I guess they've got a sort of C-SPAN thing too. Now, the bulk of his excellent lecture was devoted to an analysis and critique of a range of factors leading to the impoverishment of legislative deliberation, and it applies not just to New Zealand, warranting the stinging title he assigned to his lecture, Parliamentary Recklessness. Its penultimate section, entitled Parliamentary Debate, offers a thoroughly gloomy appraisal. But instead of ending there, offering no grounds for hope, Professor Waldron concludes with a section entitled The Quality of Public Debate, in which he points to the possibility that the deficiencies of parliamentary debate may be at least partially compensated for or offset by a higher quality of public debate among citizens, and even hints that a higher quality of public debate could prompt the reforms necessary to at least begin restoring the integrity of parliamentary debate. But he warns that things could also go the other way. The corruption of parliamentary debate could, and I quote him, infect the political culture at large, unquote, driving public debate down to the condition of parliamentary debate, a condition he chillingly describes in the following terms. See if this is familiar to you. Even though you're not from New Zealand, I assume. Parliament becomes a place where the governing party thinks it has won a great victory when debate is closed down and measures are pushed through under urgency. And the social and political forum generally becomes a place where the greatest victory is drowning out your opponent with the noise that you can bring to bear. And then the premium is on name-calling, on who can bawl the loudest, who can most readily trivialize an opponent's position, who can succeed in embarrassing or shaming or, if need be, blackmailing into silence anyone who holds a different view, unquote. So in a sense, it is up to the people to decide whether they will rise above the corruption that has demeaned parliamentary or congressional or legislative politics, or permit it to infect the public culture at large. But remember that the people are not some undifferentiated mass. The people are you and me, individuals. Of course, considered as isolated actors, there's not a lot that any one of us can do to affect the political culture, but individuals can cooperate for greater effectiveness in prosecuting an agenda of conservation or reform, and they can create associations and institutions that are capable of making a difference. Advocacy groups, think tanks, even tea parties or Occupy Wall Streets. A critical element of any discussion of the quality of democratic deliberation and decision-making that amounts to anything more than hot air will be the indispensable role of non-governmental institutions of civil society, those little platoons, yet again, in sustaining a culture in which political institutions do what they are established to do it well, and don't do what they are not authorized to do. Don't usurp the authority of other non-governmental bodies and institutions and associations. And so we must be mindful that bad behavior on the part of political institutions, which means bad behavior on the part of the people who exercise power as holders of public offices, can weaken, enervate, and even corrupt those institutions of civil society, rendering them for all intents and purposes impotent to resist the bad behavior and useless to the cause of political reform. They can be hijacked, often with the lure of governmental money, or under the pressure of threats of governmental sanction. My point, and this is why I promised to return at the end to the importance of institutions of civil society, is that this is true generally, and it's certainly true with respect to the bad behavior of public officials who betray their obligations to serve by transgressing the bounds of their constitutional authority and the limits embodied in the doctrine of subsidiarity. Constitutional structural constraints are important, but they will be effective only where they are effectually supported by the people, that is, by the political culture. Without the support, which means also the understanding of the people, politicians will blow through those constraints like it's nobody's business, like it's Jell-O. If the people aren't there guarding those limits, enforcing those constraints, power corrupts, as Lord Acton, or tends to corrupt, as Lord Acton said, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the people do need to understand those constraints and value them enough to resist usurpations by their rulers, even when unconstitutional programs offer immediate gratification or even the relief of urgent problems. This in turn requires certain virtues, strengths of character among the people. But these virtues don't just fall down from the heavens on people. They have to be transmitted through the generations and nurtured by each generation. Madison famously said that only a well-educated people can be permanently a free people. Truer words were never spoken. It points to the fact that even the best constitutional structures, even the strongest structural constraints on governmental power written in a constitution, aren't worth the paper they are printed on if people don't understand them, value them, and have the will to resist the blandishments those offering something tempting in return for giving them up or letting violations of them occur without swift and certain political retaliation. The political class will always have something on offer for you as a reason to expand their power and wink at those structural constraints, those limitations on their jurisdiction and authority. We'll make you happier, we'll make you safer, we'll make you better. It'll be a million things. But that's always a devil's bargain. I forget who it was who said, but it's really true that the person who's willing to sacrifice liberty for security will end up with neither liberty nor security. Was it Franklin? I think it might have been Franklin. It's absolutely right. But they're always out there, that tempting little shiny apple. Give us more power and we'll give you a great economy. Give us more power, we'll give you more security. Give us more power, we're going to make you better off. But it's also true that virtue is needed. And that's not merely a matter of improving civics teaching in homes and schools, so that would help. The Constitution of the United States was famously defended by Madison in Federalist Number 51 as, quote, supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives. He made this point immediately after observing that the first task of government is to control the people, the governed, and the second task of government is to control itself. Madison allowed that, quote, "a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions, hence those structural constraints, among other things." But even in this formulation, those constraints do not stand alone. Indeed, they are presented, you just noticed, as secondary. Let's quote him again. "A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on government." Primary. But experience has taught man the necessity of auxiliary precautions. In other words, the structural constraints are secondary. Necessary, but secondary. What's necessary primarily is a healthy and vibrant political culture, a dependence on the people to keep the rulers in line, keeping them within the scope of their own authority, not falling victim to the temptation, yielding to the temptation provided by those blandishments and what's on offer. But that brings us back to the role and importance of virtue. John Adams understood as well as anyone the general theory of the Constitution. He was the ablest scholar and political theorist of the founding generation. Better even than Jefferson. Not as good a writer, less effective personality. Adams wasn't long on the personality thing, but the ablest scholar and political theorist of the group. And that's saying something, because it was a very able group. Adams certainly got the point about supplying the defective better motives. In other words, needing structural constraints and not just relying on people themselves. Yet he too understood that the health of political culture was an indispensable element of the success of the constitutional enterprise, an enterprise of ensuring that rulers stay within the bounds of their legitimate authority and indeed be servants of the common good, servants of the people they rule. And so Adams remarked that our Constitution is made for a moral and religious people and is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. You can see he's got this point firmly in hand about the need for civic virtue, the people as the protectors of their own constitutional liberties. Now why? Because a people lacking in virtue can be counted on to trade liberty for protection, for financial or personal security, for comfort, for being looked after, for being taken care of, for having their problems solved quickly. And there will always be people occupying or standing for public office who will be happy to offer the deal, an expansion of their power, in return for what they can offer by virtue of that expansion. Always the shiny apple out there. So the question then is how to form people fitted out with the virtues, making them worthy of freedom and capable of preserving constitutionally limited government, even in the face of strong temptations, which inevitably come to compromise it away. Here we see the central political role and significance, I believe, of the most basic institutions of civil society, the family, the religious community, private organizations that are devoted to the inculcation of knowledge and virtue, private, often religiously based educational institutions like this one, and other organizations and associations that are in the business of transmitting essential virtues. These are indeed, as is often said, mediating institutions, institutions that provide a buffer between the individual and the power of the central state. It's ultimately the autonomy, integrity, and general flourishing of these institutions that will determine the fate of limited government. If they're flourishing, limited government can survive. If they decay or collapse, I assure you, limited government will disappear. And this is not only because of the primary and indispensable role in transmitting virtues of these civic associations and non-governmental institutions. It's also because of their performance of essential health, education, and welfare functions. That's what prevents the removal of those functions to larger and higher associations, and ultimately, of course, to government. When government expands to play the primary role in performing these functions, the ideal of limited government is soon lost, no matter how good the formal structures and constraints of the Constitution are. They become like the old Soviet Constitution, which was great on paper, or the Chinese Constitution, which if you read it, you would say, wow, great, well, there must be a lot of liberty there. And the corresponding weakening of the status and authority of these institutions damages their ability to perform all of their functions, including their moral and pedagogical ones. With that, they surely lose their capacity to influence for good the political culture, which at the end of the day is the whole shooting match when it comes to whether the rulers truly can be and will be servants. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so do we have any questions for Professor George? Do we need to use the mic?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Tell me who you are and where you're from.
My name's Ryan. I'm from Mission Viejo, California.
Oh, okay, good. Welcome.
And yeah, I went to public school K through 12, but I know a lot of my peers went to private schools and were homeschooled, which is, you know, run by families and communities and private organizations, which is obviously lower than the state. So I was wondering, based on the Doctrine of Subsidiarity, like what you thought the proper place for compulsory state education was.
Well, I'm certainly opposed to compulsory state education. I mean, the idea that all children should be hustled into public schools and that private schools should be abolished and that homeschooling should be abolished. The Supreme Court faced this issue in the 1920s, if I've got the date right, the time frame right, in a case called Pierce against the Society of Sisters, where the state of Oregon, under a strongly anti-Catholic sentiment, attempted to force kids into public schools so that they wouldn't get Catholic educations. It was connected strongly to nativism, and there was a Ku Klux Klan element supporting it and so forth. And the Supreme Court, in a decision that has good outcome, whether the reasoning was very good is a debatable proposition, but a good outcome, struck that down and said, no, you know, it's a basic part of your constitutional liberties that parents have the right to direct the upbringing and education of their children, which means that if they want to put them into private and religious schools, they should. And of course, the same argument applies to homeschooling. From my own experience as a university teacher for 29 years, I find that kids who are products of private schools, and especially religious schools, and homeschooled kids are terrific. They're extremely well educated. There's no question in my mind that private schools and homeschooling can compete, usually best, outperform the public schools when it comes to delivering quality education. I also like the fact that there is you have a stronger possibility of delivering a strong moral education, a strong values education when it's private, and especially religious-based education, and certainly with homeschooling that's true as well. Now that raises the question, okay, well, compulsory private education, public education is bad. Parents should have the choice to direct their children as they see best when it comes to education. Should we have state-run education at all?
Yeah.
John Stuart Mill, the famous liberal John Stuart Mill, the founding father in many ways of what we think of as liberalism today, opposed it. The great author of On Liberty opposed state education, state-run education. Why? He had a big worry, and I worry about it too. His big worry was groupthink, that the public schools would become catechism classes for the dissemination, the inculcation of the dogmas of the day. Those dogmas might be a particular religious view in the case of a particular state, or they could be a secularist view, like a secularist liberal view, like one that dominates much of public education today. And I think that's a legitimate worry. Now, I've seen a lot of good come out of public schools, so I don't want to jump all the way to Mill's position on that and say, you know, we shouldn't have public education at all. Public education has done a lot of good for a lot of people, but I think there should be genuine, fair competition. That's why I support programs like charters, school choice. I want to put the resources into the hands of parents, especially poor people, poor parents, to put their kids in whatever schools they think are best, whether they're public, whether they're charter, whether they're private, whether they're religious. And I want to strongly, vigorously protect the right of homeschooling, which will continue to come under attack from people who just don't like it for ideological reasons, or they associate it with evangelical Christianity or with other views that they regard as backward. But I think a sound system for us today would be one in which 1,000 educational flowers bloom, and parents really do have options as to where to send their kids. Good question, though.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had to
Tell me your name and where you're from.
Oh, okay. I'm Kevin Ross. I'm from Livermore, California.
Oh.
And my question is, if you had to recreate or reinstitute the Constitution, would you change it? And if so, how?
That's not fair. That's the question I ask on my constitutional interpretation exam. You're not supposed to ask me. I'm supposed to ask you that. Did one of my students, there's some Facebook deal, they said ask him the question from the... I don't know about you guys. Well, it's a very interesting question. Sometimes I look at the way the courts have interpreted some provisions, and I say, gosh, we got to fix that. I mean, that can't be right as an interpretation of, let's say, the first few words of the First Amendment. So I say to myself, gosh, if I were rewriting the Constitution, if that's what it means, if I were rewriting the Constitution, I'd write something like, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, I'd say the same thing they said, but say, and this time we really mean it. So that's one thing. I would make the Constitution less difficult to amend, especially if I were going to accept the doctrine of judicial review. And if I were going to accept the doctrine of judicial review, I think I would want to actually delegate the power to the federal courts in Article 3, instead of leaving it as an unwritten, allegedly implied power of uncertain constitutional standing. But I think if you're going to have the courts in that role, Professor Waldron's right. You're taking a chance. You're taking a risk of judicial rule. The thing that Jefferson worried about when he said that the rulings of John Marshall were going to put us under the despotism of an oligarchy, or what Lincoln worried about when in vowing resistance to Dred Scott, he said that if I'm supposed to take what the Supreme Court says as binding not only on the parties to the case, but on the other branches of government as a general rule, then we will have resigned self-government, Republican government, of the people, for the people, by the people, into the hands of that eminent tribunal. Those are real worries. Those are legitimate. We don't worry about them enough. So I think what I would do is give the people an easier opportunity to undo the bad judicial rulings by making the Constitution more easily amendable, even if that meant that what they would amend it by doing was just adding the words, and this time we mean it. Yeah. I don't think I would alter the two most fundamental things, though. The idea of the general government as a government of delegated and enumerated powers, and the idea of a dual sovereignty where the states' powers are not derivative of the national government but are plenary, that states exercise general jurisdiction, the police powers to uphold public health, safety, and morals and advance the common good. That's the core of the thing. So what am I saying? Okay, you really got me going here. I guess what I'm saying, that as a practical matter, in answer to the question, is I'm against the guys who now say the Madisonian system was an 18th century document that doesn't apply to the 21st century, an 18th century idea that doesn't apply to the 20th century. In the words of my predecessor as McCormick Professor Woodrow Wilson, who was a critic of the Madisonian system, who said, the Constitution is a Newtonian document that doesn't work in a Darwinian age. I don't agree. I don't agree. I like the fact that we've got structural constraints that slow things down, make change hard, make legislation a difficult task, that that force us to be deliberative in making our decisions? Great question. It's such a good question, I ask it myself. You know that line of Lou Costello probably doesn't mean anything to anybody but us, right? There was a comedian, Lou Costello, you know, who used to say, "What a great idea. I was just about to think it myself." Yeah.
My name is John Garcia. I'm local La Mirada here.
You're at where?
I'm local La Mirada.
Oh, okay.
In light of how vastly split Americans are currently, just polar opposites in terms of certain parties pulling one way and the other party pulling the other way.
You mean contemporary polarization?
Sure.
Yeah, not historical. Yeah.
No, yes, absolutely. And especially in light of the spectrum and kind of it looks like where we're going. How does the voice in the wilderness, so to speak, advocate for the value of the family and the smaller entity, which advocates justice and the things that help us to thrive in an economic society as such?
I think one way is by learning to make the argument, understanding the historic reasons why in our culture and philosophical tradition, that what Isaiah Berlin called, and I quoted him, the central tradition of thought about politics and the common good in the West, we've assigned such an important role to the institutions of civil society as buffers between the individual and the state, as alternative authority structures, so that authority is disseminated and not concentrated in any one set of hands, especially the poisonous conspiracy of big business and big government creating a kind of crony capitalism and plutocracy. Mastering on top of the philosophical arguments, the sociological literature, and staying up with it, because that's a changing literature. That literature consistently gives us the message that the functioning, the health of the institutions of civil society is vital to the well-being of people, especially the least well-off. That is the story every time somebody does a piece of good work in sociology. We'd be shocked, I'd be shocked, if you had a good piece of sociology that contradicted the story, because it just keeps piling up, whether it's the work of, I've mentioned some of them today in the small group meetings, Linda Waite at the University of Chicago, or Isabel Sawhill at the Brookings Institution, or my colleague Sarah McClanahan at Princeton, you know, again and again. You see that the functioning of the marriage-based family, the civic association, the religious institution is utterly crucial to the well-being of people in the communities they serve. You know, in some communities, like in inner-city areas, largely minority areas, it's the church alone, the black church alone, churches like Kojic and AME and so forth, that are holding it together to the extent that it's being held together at all. And they're having to bear too much of the burden because of the breakdown of the family and other institutions of civil society. And you know, what happens in those circumstances is what you'd expect. The government has to come in for two reasons: to provide security and to provide social services. And you know, they end up not doing either very well. It's straining capacities. It's causing increases in tax rates. It's making it more difficult to attract business and people to these communities, and so you end up in a vicious cycle. So my advice would be to really master the philosophical tradition and the reasons that have been articulated for the value we have placed historically on the institutions of civil society, and then stay up with the sociological literature to the extent you can. Now, that doesn't mean you have to actually read the studies by McClanahan or Waite or Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia, or anybody like that. In today's world, you get on the internet and you can find reliable digests of this stuff, so you know what's going on. You have to learn to sort out the good from the bad. There are all sorts of politicized studies that claim to prove this, that, or the other thing. But they're good ways of filtering out. You can tell what the good work is from the bad work without even having to get into the footnotes of this or that particular study. And then I think it's a matter of being a good citizen and going out and making the case. And I would hope, especially for students who have the benefit of the Biola education, that you would not simply vote in an informed way, but that you would be public voices in defense of the institutions of civil society and the vital role that they play in the overall common good. You'd be witnesses, I think. Yeah.
My name is Robert Sullivan. I'm from Fresno, California. My question is sort of two-pronged. First being, with the with the sort of judicial supremacy that we currently have in our Supreme Court, since it seems that Congress has acquiesced their authority to debate the Constitution, what do you think would be the best way to undo this? And secondly, you already expressed a sense of that you advocate a sense of limited judicial review, but what do you think is a proper scope of judicial review, and how limited or how broad should that be?
The second question would require, I'll give you a short answer, but it'll be unsatisfactory. That second question is a big, important one that would require more detail than I can go into. Clearly, it's true that the courts are functioning in their exercise of the power of judicial review far more extensively than was anticipated, even by people who, like Hamilton, who did think that judicial review could legitimately be inferred from the Constitution, although it's not an expressly granted power under Article 3 to the judiciary. And that's a problem. That's what gives you the kind of rule by judiciary, that there are issues that plainly ought to be decided by the people, either directly through referendum initiative or through their elected representative. The marriage case is a good one, right, where there's not a constitutional warrant for judicial intervention. Abortion was another one. There are lots and lots of them. We wait to hear every spring what the Supreme Court's opinions on how we should organize ourselves and live our lives as a political community. That doesn't make sense in light of the founding understanding. Now, there is a role for the courts. I mean, if judicial review can be legitimately inferred, and I think a good case can be made that it can. I think what Hamilton believed was perfectly reasonable. There will be a place for judicial review, but it's far more extensive than what I think could be justified. So what to do about it? Well, there are many proposals, strip jurisdiction from the Supreme Court and other federal courts over certain subject matters pursuant to the second paragraph of the third article of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate the jurisdiction of the courts. I think there are things that probably could be done by that mechanism and that haven't been tried yet and maybe ought to be tried, but for reasons that are too complicated to go into, there's a limit to what you could do with that. It's a very limited way of dealing with the problem, but we should do anything we can, so I think there's some areas where that might make sense. Secondly, I think it would be a good thing, in principle, to overturn, as has been done in the past, to overturn a bad Supreme Court ruling by a constitutional amendment. Right? Dred Scott was overruled by the 14th Amendment. Section 1 of the 14th, the first sentence of the 14th Amendment actually overrules the key element of Dred Scott denying citizenship to blacks, even free blacks. It seems to me that a shot over the bow of the Supreme Court, of the justices, of the judiciary, saying, look, the people are not just going to be supine. They're not just going to be content to be subjects, not to a president, not to a king, not to guys in black robes. I think that would be a salutary thing to do. I think there are places at the margins, prudentially done, carefully considered, where the other branches of Congress, of government, where Congress and the president should refuse to go along. They should exercise the power that Lincoln rightly said each branch has to interpret the Constitution for itself. Now, I here lay the emphasis on prudence. Very, very often, the prudentially correct thing to do would be to acquiesce, at least for the time being, hoping for the decision to be overturned or for the people to be able to amend the Constitution, to acquiesce even in a bad constitutional judgment. But that doesn't mean every time. That doesn't mean there won't be some times when prudence dictates a different course, and a president or Congress simply rejecting a Supreme Court ruling. You see a version of this, although not exactly the kind you and I are talking about right now, but you see a version of this in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993, which is now the basis of the Hobby Lobby case, and the Little Sisters of the Poor case, and the Wheaton College case, and the Belmont Abbey case. That act was passed by Congress by bipartisan majorities, signed into law in both houses, signed into law by President Clinton, supported from across the spectrum, people from the American Way, Moral Majority, ACLU, Christian Coalition, as an effort to overturn the Supreme Court's decision in Employment Division of Oregon against Smith, which is the famous case about the Native American Indian Church, which had peyote, used this hallucinogenic drug called peyote in its sacramental purposes. For sacramental purposes, they weren't drug abusers, they weren't people who were pretending to be a church in order to use drugs or anything like that. Everybody realized it was a good faith tradition of the American Indians of this particular tradition and so forth. When the Supreme Court ruled that there was no free exercise protection for religious activity in the face of neutral laws of general applicability, that they would not, that if a law was a neutral law of general applicability, the state had no obligation in enforcing the law against objectors to demonstrate that the law was supported by a compelling state interest and represented the least restrictive or intrusive means of prosecuting that interest. When the court handed down that ruling, overturning earlier precedent, Congress reacted by passing a law that reinstituted the compelling state interest, least intrusive or restrictive means test as a statutory requirement. That was a sort of shot across the bow. That was a refusal to take the dictate of the judges sitting down. Now, what was the second half of the question that I said would take a complicated answer? I've forgotten it.
The second half was, what is your opinion on what is a limited scope, or what is the best scope of judicial review?
Oh, yeah. The short and unsatisfactory answer is I favor departmentalism. Do you know what that means? Others might not, so just in case. It's the idea that each branch must interpret the Constitution for itself in the exercise of its own authority. So this would allow for Marbury versus Madison, interpreted as a case in which the justices had to decide for themselves whether they could or could not constitutionally accept the original jurisdiction, additional original jurisdiction conferred upon them, as they interpreted it, by the Judiciary Act of 1789. I think that's right. I mean, they do have to do that. Now, whether that translates into a power to bind the other branches of government as to the meaning of that act or their authority under that act or any other piece of legislation is a separate question. So what I want to push back against, if I were spinning out the full answer to the question, what I want to push back against is that C-SPAN idea, that judicial rulings are for the courts, and all presidents and Congresses need to be concerned about is what statutes or acts are for the common good. The courts will tell us whether it's constitutional or not. I want all branches interpreting the Constitution for themselves and acting in accordance with their best conscientious judgments as to the meaning of the Constitution. I think that's a better system. And that is not, it might sound alien today, a departmentalist approach might sound alien today, but it was something like Jefferson's view. Jefferson was strongly against this idea of judicial supremacy. Lincoln couldn't have been more clear in his first inaugural address against it. Roosevelt criticized it. The Supreme Court itself didn't get round to declaring its own supremacy in these matters until 1958. In the case of Cooper against Aaron, when the Supreme Court announced, we are supreme in the interpretation of the Constitution, a kind of anti-Lincolnian position. It tells you something that the court itself didn't get around to making that declaration. If it was so obvious, it wouldn't have taken until 1958 for them to discover it. Great question. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
I actually, what's that?
It's 12:30 for me.
Well, I had a question, but I'll ask it in just a minute.
You ask a question?
Okay. Okay, yeah. Well, I'll go. All right, last question.
Who are you and where are you from? No, sorry.
In light of the idea of an instrumental political common good, how do you describe the value of patriotism?
Oh, sure, sure. The political common good, though instrumental, is, to quote Aristotle, great and godlike in its scope of ambition and its importance. The provision of those conditions of liberty that enable us to have blessings that most of mankind, for most of history, and even in most places today, could only dream about. The provision of those goods, those blessings, is something worth honoring and praising and standing up for, and if necessary, even dying for, as men did at Lexington and Concord, and Antietam and Gettysburg, and the Somme, and the beaches of Normandy, and Afghanistan and Iraq. That's, I think, the essence of patriotism. The other thing is, there is a sense, there's a true sense in which our political community is a kind of motherland or fatherland, as the Europeans tend to say. Now, we Americans rightly sort of get a little nervous at that language because of its association with mid-20th century fascism, and we're right to be a little nervous at that language. But there is still an element of truth in that we love our country because the country is ours. It's like we love our mother because our mother is ours. Our mother might not be the greatest mother in the world. She might have some serious defects. Nevertheless, we love our mother because she's ours. There's that bond of blood and feeling, that commonality we have with her, or a father, or a grandfather, or grandmother, or what have you. We might not even like them very much. We may notice that they've got some flaws, but there's nevertheless that obligation where love is considered not merely an emotion, but as an act of the will, of a willing of the good of the other for the sake of the other. We should love our country precisely in that sense, not just as a feeling, but as the active willing of the good of the country, the willing of the good of all of us who constitute the country, with whom we have much in common, including the blessings of liberty and a common constitutional system and common protections and a common history, including a history of sacrifice and struggle. It's got a lot of flaws, our history, the flaw of slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, there are plenty of things that have been wrong, but part of the history is the correcting of those things as well. So being good citizens means acting for the good of the country. It means actively willing the good of the country. The same thing that love really means, most fundamentally, in our personal relationships. We make a really bad mistake if we think what love really is a feeling, even in the context of romantic love. The feeling is nice, and it's part of the perfection of the bond. But what's at the foundation is an act of the will. It's the act of willing of the other for the good of the other, and not simply because of what you get out of it, the instrumental value of the relationship. You miss that, you miss the whole thing at any level, from love of spouse to love of parents to love of community to love of country.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.